All right, so welcome everybody to the IT Factor or IT Factor. Today we have Joe Denton, who is a cloud security architect with USAA. I know Joe from a very long time ago, UT Dallas. I think you were in my freshman class. I don't remember what year that was.
2009.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, so great to see you. I'm going to have you just kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you currently do.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Joe Denton. I guess my title is Staff Public Cloud Security Architect at USAA. If you don't know USAA, it's a Fortune 100 banking and insurance company. We've got the really bad commercials with Rob Gronkowski right now. If you haven't seen them, they're terrible. You should look them up. I've been at USAA for, I think, 6 years now. Been in cybersec for 2 years, so actually pretty new to cybersecurity. But I was a DevOps or a software engineer for a little bit over a decade before that. Prior to USAA, I was at a smaller company, not really a startup. I call it the upstart because it was a long established company, but they were pivoting, and so I got to be on the pivot team, and that was out in the Bay Area, which was really fun. Really cool startup vibes. And then before that, I was back in Richardson, Dallas area. I started after school my career at Cisco Systems. My claim to fame, it's not much. Sorry, pup. It's not much, but if you've ever seen the Transformers movies or like the TV show The Office or Silicon Valley, any of the office desk phones on camera, I helped make the UIs for those. So it's obscure and it's niche, but yeah.
Nice, that's cool.
Yep.
So tell us more like about your career path. Like what was your plan to, like, when you were growing up and you're like, I'm gonna go to college and this is what I want to do, and then like how did that kind of change and pivot into cyber?
Sure. So it's kind of been all over the place. I'll be honest with you. In high school, I started the chemistry club at Plano Senior at the time, and ended up getting a full ride to UTD for academics, which was cool. I was going to study chemical engineering. It was kind of the dead set plan. And then day one of signing up for classes, I pivoted and signed up for an EMAC degree, which it was emerging media communications. It was kind of part of their arts and technology, I guess, subspace. But yeah, I kind of just out of nowhere decided that chemical engineering sounded fun, but I wanted to be more well-rounded and do some more artsy things. And so EMAC sounded fun and interesting. And social media was, I'm not going to say new at the time, but, utilizing it for marketing at the time was new. And I think there was a lot of interesting things people were doing at the time, like hacking Twitter and using it to like make art and things along those lines. So it was an interesting path to go down for me. I'll also say, I think at the time UTD was mostly their computer science program was a Java shop, and I despise Java with a passion. So I didn't want to go down that route. I knew for a fact. But yeah, so did EMAC, started a freelance web development company, probably I think second semester of freshman year, just to do some JavaScript, HTML, CSS stuff for local businesses to make money. Ended up really liking it. And so did a lot of self-studies junior and senior year of college with like Linux and shells and looking at Ruby on Rails and Node.js, which were kind of newer at the time, but just looking at some of the newer programming languages and paradigms and really just playing around and having fun and calling it class credits, which was cool. But yeah, graduated from there and got a job at Cisco Systems. And so it was an interesting job. I think the title was UX engineer, but really it was sort of the bridge between the computer science guys and being able to talk about the limits of OpenGL or the limits of like Android's rendering system with the UX designers who were like, I want to do the craziest thing you can think of with this UI, and grounding them both in reality somewhere in the middle, which was fun. It meant a lot of prototypes and a lot of learning what OpenGL was and doing that kind of stuff, which was fun. And then, yeah, from there transition to the more startup vibes, which was still unified communications per se. So it was essentially VoIP phones and a lot of technologies around how to make those more interesting and easier to use. Around the time that Twilio was coming up, if you know what Twilio is, it's a telecom API, do some really interesting things with texting and calls. So doing some cool stuff there and wrapping it in a product. But yeah, ended up wanting to move back to Dallas. And so wanted to get back to a larger company. Startups are fun. Working 16 hours a day is not fun. So ended up landing a job at USAA as a DevOps engineer. And I guess the rest is history. Been there for the last 6 years. I guess to go a bit deeper, I came into USAA at a really interesting time. I think they're a very old company. This year is our 100th anniversary. But they're, banking and insurance, but you've probably never seen a USAA bank because they don't exist. Like, we don't have physical locations. It's a bank entirely driven by a fantastic fleet of member service reps answering the phone and then technology. And so when I joined, they were at this really interesting pivotal point where they were transitioning from legacy infrastructure into more modern infrastructure, things like containers and Docker, looking at Kubernetes, switching from Java rendered server side web applications to React and some of the new front end technologies. And so I got to really come in and help guide what were some, in my opinion, typically pretty legacy engineers and applications towards what modern infrastructure looked like. And a lot of that manifested in embracing DevSecOps principles, which I think is really cool. It's something I'm really passionate about. Did that for 4 years. 2 years ago, came over to the cloud side. So USA is starting to dabble in the cloud, which is cool. Spent a year there building out some, again, infrastructure on a platform team for functions as a service and containers. And really just came over to security because it seemed like security was always a roadblock. And, there's this really interesting, I call it this diametric opposition between like the business's goals and then the business of security's goals, because you want to innovate and you want to deliver new tech, but then you want to go as slow as possible so you have time to secure it. And somewhere in the middle there, I think there's a balance you can strike that's the happy place. And I really think I came over to security because of that DevSecOps mindset and automating everything, really shifting security to the left, as they say, using a lot of CI/CD pipelines and stuff. And yeah, spent a year and a half as a lead engineer in security, and 45 days ago, so pretty still new to me, transitioned over into architecture. And I guess it's a traditional enterprise IT architect role. That was a lot of words. Sorry.
No, that was great. Like, I don't know. I think it's just cool how you always think you're going to start out doing one thing, right? And then that just kind of changes as you have these opportunities and you try different things, right? Like, I think it's only like 27% of people actually do what their degree is in, which I think is just kind of interesting because, it gives you a lot of opportunity. So going from like, emerging media and communication, which again, like you said, at that time, it was kind of like the cool hot thing that was happening. What are some things that you've had to like work on and learn along the way, like certifications you might have to have gotten, like things that you had to just really intentionally learn to kind of, go to the next thing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will say 100% of the skills that I think I use in my career and have used have been self-taught. I think the best thing college did for me was teaching me how I learned so that I could go out and learn faster and better and learn the things that were impactful to the industry at the time. Everyone says it, and it's very true that any type of technical role is a constant role of learning. If you become stagnant or you rest on your laurels, you'll realize in 5 years you probably don't have a lot of marketable skills. So for me, it was really from the ground up building a base. I ended up getting a Bachelor of Art, and I really liked a lot of the creative things that I got to learn, but the technical side was pretty shallow. So I started at the bottom. I think I failed to install Linux like 3 times. Really taught myself from the ground up, terminal shells, how everything worked. There's a really good book, I think it's called Code, that really talks through from electrical signaling all the way up through, gates and logic gates, all the way up through how it gets implemented in code, and then higher level abstraction. but just starting with the foundation and teaching myself skills along the way. I will say, learn Linux and learn the terminal. I'd say it's probably like 75% of the interns are okay at terminal and 25% are really good. And those 25% oftentimes end up being the ones that do really well because they know the language that really the computer is speaking, and it's easier to get tasks done. But once you have a good solid, I guess, foundation with things like Linux and terminals, pick one language, don't bounce around a lot, but pick one language and learn it really well, not just how to write code in it, but how that language gets translated. And I'm sure some of y'all pick a lot of this up, but like, look at C once it's compiled and look at the assembly it gets turned into, and look at the, the binary output. Like, there's a whole process going on there, and everything, the modern languages at least, oftentimes are built on top of those sorts of things. So just having a good understanding all the way down the stack, but then all the way up the stack, super important. But yeah, really just learning all the time. When USA hired me to come modernize their enterprise, I was a front end developer, and I came in and they were like, cool, modernize the back end. I was like, okay, I guess I'll go learn that.
Yeah, I think that's, it's challenge accepted, right? You're not going to be like, yeah. I don't know what I'm doing. You're like, okay, I'm just going to go learn it. Like,
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conferences are huge. Luckily today, especially with things like cloud computing, there's so many, conferences and materials out there. AWS has certs and a Cloud Guru, if you haven't heard of it, is a fantastic little training site that's got a bunch of classes. I actually recently got another cloud cert, and a Cloud Guru basically was the mechanism through which I prepped for it. So if you want something specific and you're interested in cloud, I'd really start there.
Cool. Yeah, we do. We have a AWS certs through our continuing ed side. And then part of FlexTech is cool because we do reimbursements for certification tests. So all the students that are in the program have like $500 they can get reimbursed for, which is nice.
It's like 5 certs. That's awesome.
Yeah, depending on what you get. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So what is your day-to-day like? What do you do?
Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting, and it's different at different companies, and especially at larger enterprises. But I'll say that at USAA, and I know this pretty well because I was on the engineering team for a really long time, we've got a public cloud program, and we really take we put a model into motion where you've got different areas or centers of excellence. So security, infrastructure, operations, platform, and data. Sorry, mail was delivered. So you've got like these 4 COEs, right? And that's what the cloud program is. And each COE probably has somewhere between 1 and 5 engineering scrum teams. So you've got them all delivering work, and that's great. And they're all driving towards similar goals. Architecture is really not looking at the work that's being done today. Obviously, you have to care about the work that's being delivered, but it's more strategizing for, okay, what's next? Here's where we're driving towards now. Like, what are the business's goals? Are we aligned to what they need now? But more importantly, are we going to be aligned to where the business's needs are going to be in 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 months? And I really enjoy that. I'm really passionate about technology. And so for me, I get paid to read a lot of articles and blog posts and white papers just to figure out where the industry is going. Probably spend 2 hours a day on Hacker News. I'm just trying to see what's going on and maybe where I need to go deeper. A lot of it for me ends up being meetings, just because that's the beast of the enterprise. You are dictating technology strategy and direction. And oftentimes those dictations are writing standards. Thou shalt use the cloud as such. And teams have a lot of questions on, well, what does as such mean? So talking through a lot of different architectures and implementations is a lot of what the job is. Like, what do you really mean when you say encrypted in transit? I mean, it's encrypted in transit, and here's what that means: TLS 1.2 using these cipher suites, whatever it ends up being. But yeah, for me, it's a lot less hands-on keyboard. I used to write code 5-6 hours a day. Now I don't really get to write code at work anymore. It's more so thinking higher level at sort of that strategic direction, and really making sure that the enterprise, because if you think about USAA, it's insurance, it's banking, and it's other financial services. So you've got different lines of business, like there's property and casualty, bank, the life co, and making sure that the way that they all operate is uniform, right? You're setting enterprise direction for a broad range of different use cases and teams that are implementing. So a lot of that is meeting with technology leadership across the lines of business, just making sure that they're all traveling down a similar path, so that 5 years from now, you don't have, well, banks using one language and they're doing security this way, PNC is doing it that way, and life's doing it that way. And you've got this fragmentation that's honestly really, really hard and probably impossible to keep a handle on. So you're going to have a breach is what it ends up being.
Yeah. So it sounds like a whole lot of communication.
Yep. A lot of emails and Slack.
So, what kind of people would be good at this? Like, if you're like, hey, if you're a student, you're like, I don't know about this. Like, what all do I need to know besides the technical or like work on?
Sure. Architecture, and I'll say lead engineering too, in some capacity, are the first positions typically in a company where it's not just how good do you know the tech, it's how good do you know the tech and how good of a business partner are you. And a lot of the times that means being able to have some of the soft skills, which can be hard, but having the soft skills to be able to talk to the business, to talk to the technology engineering teams, and find where the middle ground is. It's not for everyone. Some people want to go heads down tech all the way and just they can write code really fast and really efficiently, and that's great, and that's definitely something you can do in the industry. But for some of the more leadership positions or architectural positions, it is more, I'm not going to say political. It feels political at times because you have to go like, I've got this vision for, zero trust security in the cloud. I now have to go campaign for everyone else to agree that's a good idea, and, make sure that we have the funding to go do that. Right.
So you're kind of selling stuff in a way, right? You're selling like, hey, this is a good idea. I have to sell this to you, right? Or get you on board.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting. If you look at how like the RFC process works, like all the different technology, like IEEE, all that stuff, the way that they do like requests for comments and formal technology direction, it's pretty similar, right? You're coming up with a good idea. You're documenting what that means. You should do this. You may do this. You should not do this. And then you're circulating it amongst peers to get buy-in and make sure that the idea is solid.
Okay. Yeah. So I have a question from a student. So what are steps that you would recommend to get into cloud security? So say you're just starting out right now, right?
Sure. The certs are obviously a really good place to start. If I'm doing an interview and I can see an intern or a college hire and they've already got cloud certs with the CSP that we use, it's huge, because I know I'm not going to have to go back to square one and teach them the foundations. We can start with some of the more in-depth, higher level topics. So I would say pick a cloud provider that you are passionate about and just learn as much as you can about it and get certified. I will say, and this is a bit of a tangent, but for me personally, when I'm interviewing, I try to get, like, I'm asking questions and I obviously want the answers, but I don't want regurgitation. What I really want is passion. And you can tell pretty quickly if someone's passionate about something, just by having a conversation with them about the topic and probing where their depth is. So make sure that if you do want to go into cloud security, it's something that you're passionate about, because you're going to be spending a lot of your time at work and maybe even some time outside of work or working long hours researching that specific topic. And if it's something that you're not passionate about, it's very difficult to find the motivation to do that as much as you need to stay ahead of the industry.
Yeah. You basically kind of have to be able to nerd out on things, right?
Oh yeah.
So I had another question. Says, I feel like many entry-level IT and cloud jobs are primarily customer support roles. How do you level up your skills to move out of a support role?
That's a good question. Titles in the industry are the most misconflated things in the world. A lot of people asking for DevOps engineers, cloud security professionals, or even any entry-level software engineering positions, you have to be really careful to read the actual job description and see what they're asking and see what they want, right? It's going to depend a lot on the company. Again, if you're looking to really level up the skills to move out of a support role, certs are huge. And, code, that's the big differentiator, right? Being the person who can write code, who can look at code, versus the person who knows enough about the cloud to know how it works, but can't dive into the code, is a huge difference. Especially when you look at a modern enterprise, our infrastructure is code. Everything that we do is stood up via CloudFormation or Terraform. And if you don't have the skills to do code, now you're missing out on the software process, you're missing out on the infrastructure process. And if security gets pushed left as much as we are pushing it, you're missing out on the security process. And if those are the three main pillars of security or of IT other than data, well, I got news for you, data is also moving to code. So it's really one of those foundational pieces that you have to know now. I don't know if universities are teaching coding as in depth as they should for cybersec degrees. You guys could tell me probably better than I know, but some of the interns that I get are really looking for like a security analyst role instead of looking at like a security engineering role. And the security engineering roles, I think, are the ones that have a lot of upward mobility and are really interesting.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hey, nice to meet you, Joe. I'm Zane. So I have two questions really. First one is, since you're kind of planning the strategy for cybersecurity in the future a bit, or at least seeing what the landscape looks like, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, besides the fundamental skills that, students can develop now, what are some things that you think might be coming up in the future that we could kind of keep an eye on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I broached him a bit, but like infrastructure as code and doing everything as a CI/CD pipeline is pretty huge right now. I've, full candor, I've interviewed at a lot of companies over the last year. I'm staying at USAA, but the one constant through all of them, for even the principal and the distinguished engineer roles, is a centralization around a pipeline and code. A lot of the strategy that I'm pushing at USAA is centered around that too. So it's not just, okay, so we've got the potential for a vulnerability in the cloud. It's no longer about how do I detect that in the cloud and respond to it. That's obviously still a big piece of it, but now it's how do I detect the code that would deploy that and stop it before it gets deployed. Really pushing things more towards preventative controls rather than detect and respond controls. And I was just talking about, I think a lot of that comes down to knowing how to code and knowing really well source control. If you can use Git like the back of your hand, know it really well and use it well, you can dive into any source code repository, whether it's an application or infrastructure, and look at how that's evolved over time, when certain vulnerabilities were introduced, and what needs to happen to remediate some of those vulnerabilities. But a lot of it comes down to automation. And so I think the code thing's big. The other one I would harp on, and I think this is it's only going to get bigger, but AI and ML for security to detect anomalies is probably something. I mean, I can't say go learn machine learning and AI in depth, and that's what you should focus on. But a lot of the newer companies are pitching technology now where they're using models to look for anomalies within what's happening in your cloud environment to detect, hey, for the last year, you've never done this, and now this is happening. Are you sure this is what you want to happen? Which I think is really valuable, because when you have the human element, there's always going to be mistakes, but having a human element as well as some automation there to detect deviations is only going to improve your ability to catch those things.
All right. I've got a couple other questions from our students. One's an AWS specific question. Is there a way to update your code seamlessly on an app you have deployed on AWS, or is that done via GitHub?
So It's going to depend how your infrastructure is set up. The way I would set it up is everything should be as code and everything should be run through a pipeline. With GitHub, it could be GitHub Actions. You could be using Circle CI or Travis CI. But at the end of the day, you're I don't know, probably using something like Terraform to do deployments. And you've got hopefully a mature process of within Git feature branches, mainline branch, and tagging off releases so that you can move through dev test prod. And by the time you get to prod, everything's automated. It's one of the tenets we have at USAA. No developer is allowed console access outside of dev. Test and prod is fully automated and you have to do it through code.
All right. And then speaking of code, so most of our students, like they're learning Python's usually the course that they start with code. Is that a good starting point, or what else would you recommend?
Sure. Python's really good for learning, I think, some of the building blocks of good code. So Python would be a fine place to start. Definitely don't start with something like C. You're going to want to touch it eventually, but I'd start with something higher level like Python. JavaScript's pretty good. They're both, for the most part, untyped and pretty forgiving. So it's a good place to understand, like, how does recursion work? How can I implement, this specific algorithm in code that's forgiving? And then eventually you're going to want to work your way like down other paths, right? So I would spend a good amount of time on Python or JavaScript or one of those simpler languages until you can solve any problem with it. And that sounds scary, but it's not. Just, something that you want to do, go code it, write it in Python, whether that's, I want to write a bot that scrapes Reddit and tells me when Wall Street Bets wants to sell a stock, and then I'm going to buy it because I think that they make bad decisions. Like, I tried that at one point in JavaScript and it was fun and I learned a lot. Did it work? Maybe, but that's not the point, right? The point is just to get there and do it. I will say my favorite language now, I'm pivoting a lot to Golang. So I do own Golang for USAA and sort of an ambassador for it. It's a little bit more of a nuanced language. It has pointers and it's typed, but it is still pretty simple to get into. If you look at a lot of the cloud native technologies that are in the CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, a lot of those are written in Go. Kubernetes is written in Go, Docker is written in Go, Terraform is written in Go. Like, a lot of the core technologies are written in Golang. So learning to speak that language, since it's used so much in cloud, eventually should probably be one of your goals.
Cool. All right. Let's see what else we got here for you. All right. What would you recommend as a good AWS certification path to go down? The students studying for the cloud practitioner,
Sure.
And then really not sure what path to take from there.
Cloud Prac's really good for getting like a really high level overview. I would say the first tough hurdle in the cert path is going to be Solutions Architect Associate. So I'd start there. Practitioner, Solutions Architect Associate. From there, you don't have to go straight to professional. Professional is really hard. I would knock out 2 or 3 of the associate certs. So I think if you want to learn coding, the developer one's probably pretty good. The sysadmin one is going to be pretty good as well, depending on what you want to do, but definitely the solutions architect. And then from there, specifically, if you want to get into security, the security specialty, you can do that before you get any of your professional certs. And I'd really recommend it because it teaches you some of the native things like that AWS provides out of the box and how to do security. And as kind of a bonus, I think last year, maybe it was at re:Event, but maybe not. AWS released a white paper called I think it's like the secure architecture or the secure architect framework. And it's just, hey, if I've got an organization of AWS accounts, like a couple hundred accounts, how do I baseline them and make sure that they're all secure and respond to them? And they give you diagrams of how to set the things up to make it secure that instill a lot of really good practices.
All right, thanks. It looks like I think we've got somebody with a question. So I saw Emma, you raised your hand. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask it audibly because I'm not entirely sure how to frame this question. So I've heard that I'm studying cybersecurity, and I've heard that studying cybersecurity is not the best path to take if you want to get into the cloud and get into cloud security, because that's kind of one of the fields I'm interested in is cloud security, because the cloud is becoming so big, and it's going to be a big need pretty soon. It's already a big need, but it'll just get bigger. And I'm wondering, like, how are they cybersecurity and cloud security are related, but are they like different sections? And how do you get into it from a cybersecurity start point?
Sure. It's a good question. I think cloud's the big melting pot, right? The team that I was on, which was I was lead on the public cloud security team, I have a SWE background. We had people that have been in cybersecurity for 10 years. We hired some college hires and interns that graduated from UTSA's cybersecurity program. We have a bunch of people that came over from data for the AI/ML stuff. It's a really big melting pot, right? I think to answer your question, cloud security is no different from traditional cybersecurity. It's just that the assets that you're trying to protect take on a different form, right? So it's no longer the typical metaphor people use is like, your enterprise is you've got these crown jewels you want to protect. So you build a castle, you build a moat, you build a drawbridge, and that's your network. Your perimeter is your network. Keep your network safe, and you're going to keep out most of the threats. Obviously, it's more nuanced than that. Don't let people plug in random USBs they find in the parking lot. Like things like that go into it. But at the core, you've got this network perimeter. In the cloud, a lot of that goes out the window. You've got a network perimeter, but then IAM, like identity and access management in the cloud, that's the new perimeter. If I have an AWS IAM role and that role has access to an S3 bucket in AWS, if the S3 bucket gives my role access and my role gives itself access to the bucket, I can go over private networking and download whatever I want from that bucket. The only controls used there are IAM controls because it's 100% going through AWS's backplane. I guess roundabout way, cybersecurity is still really important. I do a lot of threat modeling for a lot of different use cases. We've got traditional red teamers, we've got pen testing happening. We still do detections game days and incident response game days to practice how we would respond to incidents in the cloud. It's just the nature of what you're trying to protect changes. And what that really means is that a lot of the historical knowledge in practice still applies, but it changes a bit, which it can be hairy because you've got people who are like, well, secure the network and you're safe, as an example. It's not really true anymore. I will say, for college hires as well as experienced hires coming into cloud, for the interview process I put them through, it's a lot of security questions, but if you can't answer my one or two pretty simple coding questions, you're probably not going to get the role. And that's just because the nature of the beast is you are a security analyst or you're a security engineer who's securing our cloud by writing code. And I think, again, that's just the way the industry is going. So having a good mix of skill sets is important. If you have cybersecurity really solid as a base, that's great. Know your frameworks, your MITREs, and how TTPs get used. But then at the same time, learn how to code and learn how to automate protecting things, because that's going to be probably one of the key factors to getting in. Hopefully, I hope that answered your question, Emma.
All right. We've got another hand raised. So if you want to unmute.
Yes, I have a question on deployment on AWS. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So I've watched a few tutorials on how to deploy an app on AWS, but my confusion comes where some YouTubers say, there's a whole tutorial on how to deploy with EC2, and then some use Amplify. So then I'm like, well, with amplify is real quick and easy, but then the EC2 kind of is in depth, but it's also easy. But so I get confused as which is the typical way of, deploying, between the two.
It's a really good question. And it's the answer is nuanced, but I will say Amplify does a lot of the lifting for you. Amplify is a framework, you give it code, it goes and figures out the infrastructure. It works well for what it does. It probably works well for a lot of environments where you want to be hands off your infrastructure. Not that you're hands off liability of that infrastructure, but at least managing it. I would learn, if you're ever going to use something that pulls a lot of strings for you, learn what strings it's pulling before you let it pull those strings, right? Especially from a cybersecurity perspective. Like if I'm letting something stand up infrastructure for me, you can bet I'm going to understand what infrastructure is standing up and how that's secured. I will say nowadays, if I'm deploying a new app into AWS, and typically you're not going to lift and shift things to AWS. Like the conference is called reInvent for a reason. You're supposed to re-architect for the cloud. I would only use EC2 if a vendor gives me AMI that can only run on EC2. I would go Lambdas, I would go serverless, I would go containers. The footprint and the attack surface with EC2 is massive. So I don't know, when you're looking at deployment, independent of whether it's serverless or EC2, I wouldn't look at Amplify yet. I'd put that to the side and just focus on how you can automate with code, whether it's Terraform or CloudFormation, deploying, managing, and even like upgrading a single application. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And also, now the last thing that you mentioned, I'm sorry, Tara, I just wanted to follow up on the last question. I think Tara had asked this when I typed it, but say for instance, when I deploy an application, and then I think of something I want to add to it. If I deploy it through GitHub, so for instance, GitHub connect to Amplify, and then it's on AWS now, and then I want to add, say, another component to it. Is there a way to, how do I update that? Do I have to take everything down again and then rewrite my code and then deploy it, or is there just a way to update it?
Yes. So you said Amplify. I'm going to ignore that part because I don't think you should use Amplify. But no matter what you're doing, if you're deploying EC2, if you're deploying containers, or if you're deploying, say, like Lambda functions, you want to deploy. If you've ever heard the term, or if not, go look it up. Red-blue deployments, or sorry, blue-green deployments, or canary deployments. You should have your live code and then deploy a completely separate instance of your app running. So you have both apps running. You probably have a load balancer up here, sending 100% of your traffic here. When both code is deployed and unit tests and integration tests have been run, so this thing looks stable, start sending 1%, 5% of traffic, and make sure that your error rates don't spike. Once you're more comfortable, you bump that up 25%, 50%. And then once this gets to taking 100% of your traffic and you verify that there's no regressions, you can destroy this infrastructure. And this now goes over here. So your next deployment, again, same process. You just, green is your current 100%, and eventually then it'll be blue, and you just flip back and forth. And that
makes so much sense. I really appreciate that answer because thank you.
Sure. It makes rollbacks really easy. Like say there's a detrimental bug, like we're a bank, say, we moved the decimal place wrong. I tried to spend $100 and actually spent 1,000. That's terrible. We should never do that. That should never make it a prod. If it does, I just make it the load balancer point back here, and I only have maybe 5 minutes of like money movements to fix, right?
All right, cool. Thanks. Those are some really great questions, y'all. Keep them coming. So now back to my kind of boring, non-nuanced questions. What do you like least about your job?
Oh boy. So I think I alluded to it earlier. It's the politics. At some point in any career, If there's any advice I can give you, if something happens and you can't immediately think like, I don't know why this is happening, it's probably politics and you should just not get involved or like keep distance and not try. People, you know, in an enterprise or in a company, you never know if what someone says is what they actually mean or if they have another agenda. And it only gets worse the higher up you move. Luckily for me, I think I have a pretty good radar for that kind of thing. But it's a radar that you have to develop over time, especially in security when you're talking to a bunch of app teams that are like, well, yes, we encrypt at rest. Like, what are you doing? What are you using to do that? It doesn't matter. Like, it does matter. Getting people to tell you the honest truth is hard sometimes. So I would say the politics. The other piece is just having been a software engineer for over a decade. I really love writing code, and I hate now that as I'm in security, people think my job is to make them unproductive. I go to bed and I'm just sad because they're like, well, the best way to secure something is just to turn it off, right? And that's your goal, is to make it so we can't do our jobs. I'm like, no, I want to make your job secure.
That's really sad. You're like, I want to make it easier for you. Like,
Exactly. It's a stigma I think that security has that's changing. So culture shift.
good. So Josh, you had a question?
Yeah, so sorry if you guys hear Bluey in the background, but I wanted to make a point or sort of ask a question about those two responses. So obviously, security, we've always been seen as sort of the bad guys. We've been seen as we're not an area that produces income. We spend the money, we don't make the money. So obviously they see us as a bad guy, but also to the point of politics being sort of a negative impact on not just cybersecurity, but as to the company as a whole. Do you have any ideas, as we are sort of coming out of our degree program and into the field, how can we make an impact to shift that culture? Just as a speculation, how can we shift this culture effectively to prevent that from being an issue in the future? Because obviously it's not, I mean, politics in the workplace and negative aspects of cybersecurity, that's culture, like you noticed. How can we start that shift and be more impactful as we enter the workplace?
Sure. Yeah, I've got this whole presentation I give on this at USA. So this is a great question. It's the same thing you saw with DevOps, where traditionally you've got this like demarcation line down the middle, and you've got the dev silo and the ops silo. I build it, throw it over the fence, they run it, they say it's broken, they throw it back, and there's this whole handoff process. DevOps sought to like break down that silo and partner. And now we see with like movements like DevSecOps, which is just an extension of that, it's just breaking down one additional silo or one additional barrier. So I would say partner with engineering instead of being like the bad guy all the time. Understand what they're trying to achieve and help them understand why it's not the most secure and what that could mean. Oftentimes, I think security, at least in my experience, have been the people that say no. They need to be the people that say no, or maybe let's talk about it, and then just actually have a human conversation. I think oftentimes the human element gets left out, and it becomes, oh, these guys are trying to not use TLS 1.2. They must be dumb. Like, no, you can't do that. When instead you say, oh, does the vendor not support that? Maybe there's a compensating control we could put in place. Let's have a conversation. And that it becomes less adversarial and more, let's partner. Because at the end of the day, like they're trying to provide business value. You're trying to protect the business. You have the same goal.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. To one of the points you made there, we don't want to say no. I've heard someone in the past, I can't remember who, but they said, it's not no, it's no, but it's no, but we can do this, or, but we can do it a different way. So that sort of mentality, I totally agree. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's just really something we all deal with, right? Politics in the workplace. And I think if you're brand new, I would say if you're brand new, right, and you have no idea, one of the things I always recommend and try to do is just start, when you get there, just kind of start observing and kind of just see like, how do people interact? How do they talk? What do they talk about? And then just be kind of cautious with your approach. But my approach is always like, yeah, let's listen first, right? So seek to understand and then be understood, I think is a great way to kind of approach that. But yeah, that listening, most people just want to be heard, right?
Yeah.
So,
And unsolicited advice, find a mentor. I mentor a lot of our college hires and interns just because I really like talking to people about the career journey and what they can do to be better at it. But finding someone who, if something happens and you're like, I don't understand why that happened, where you can talk to them in a safe space and say, hey, this happened. Why did that happen? And maybe they have context that you don't have, or they can explain to you, well, at USAA, like this, or at my company, that. And just being able to help highlight some things and give you context is going to be really important to some of your growth early in your career.
yeah, that's great advice. So we've got another security-based question. Is SSL the standard for cloud protection and or encryption?
Yes. It's got to be both, right? You're talking encryption in transit and encryption at rest. Luckily, most of the AWS APIs exposed as default are all, HTTPS, SSL, TLS, which is good. But there's a whole reason that they have KMS as a service, right? And it's basically layers of protection. If you've ever heard, and I'm sure you have, defense in depth, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and then drop the basket. You want to have a basket that'll catch it. So, make sure that you're doing both is essentially my advice. There's a lot of ways to do both. And I think last week I probably read 250 pages of white papers on crypto alone on how to do it. But the base practice is just make sure that you do it and do both.
Thanks. So I know one of the concerns I've kind of heard lately is like, how do you kind of balance that work-life thing, right? Like, what does that look like for you? How do you make sure you're taking time for yourself or balancing that out?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You have to find what. I have to phrase this, like, I'm not saying push yourself to the limit, but you have to know your limit and find it and figure out what that is early and make sure you don't push past it more often than you want to. I've been burned out in my career several times. It's one of the reasons I came to USAA. Last year, I burned out. We had a particularly painful federal audit. It happens. If it's happening too often and you're working a ton of overtime, 10, 20 hours a week, and you can't have a conversation with your manager, leave, because that's not a place you want to work long-term. A lot of it's going to come down to company. Find a good place to work where they like meet your needs, but also provide you with the ability to have work-life balance. Now, for me, I like to schedule my time in chunks. So I've got my work day, not saying I won't answer emails or Slack after that, but my dog gets a portion of my time after work. My wife gets a portion of my time, and my hobbies get a portion of my time. Every other day, I also have another block of time that's just to do research and like go learn something new, typically in technology, but it's not work. Don't work after work, especially now that we're all remote, right? Have a transition. I go to work, I make coffee, I work all day, take my dog to the dog park, and when I come back, I'm not in work mode anymore. Being able to have that line is super important for your own mental health.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. That transition piece, I think, is really important because your brain is like, oh, it's all one thing now, right? If you do work remotely. So how do you break that up? When I worked from home, I was fortunate that I had an office space. So I would just never go in that room unless I was working. It's like, I just stay away from that area, right? So my brain is like, yeah, we're done. So yeah, having that transition, get outside, go do something if you can. I think that's great. Yeah. What are some skills that you want to learn next or that you're currently working towards?
It's a great one. I think I alluded to it earlier, but AI/ML is really interesting right now. We're doing a lot of really cool things at USAA with machine learning, and I think I want to do more about applying those same principles to security. I just, I think I alluded to it earlier, but anomaly detection is huge. So if you could apply maybe over the first 48 to 72 hours of an application being deployed in production, build a model of what processes are running in the container, what ports and protocols are being communicated in and out, and alert when there's a deviation from that. It's huge. But a lot of that is all vested in this massive practice of understanding how to build models, how to do AI stuff, and how to do machine learning stuff. Most of the vendors that I meet with are now bolting on some addition to their technology that's AI ML driven.
Very cool. Yeah. All right. So we're running low on time. We've got a few minutes left. So here's a fun one. If you weren't doing this job, like if you weren't in this field, what else would you do? What's your alternative?
Oh man, that's tough. It'd probably be something with technology, just because I know I like it. I'm gonna assume if I wasn't a software engineer, cybersec, or DevOps, and also if money didn't matter, man, I'd probably just travel. Like if I didn't need the money, if I did, a lot of the skilled trades are really interesting. I'd probably go into carpentry. I really like building things just around the house. So if I could, I would just work with wood all day and build chairs.
That's awesome. Very cool. Which I assume you do some of that as a hobby. So
Yeah.
yep. Awesome. Very cool. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Joe. This is great. I'm not going to profess to know half of what you're talking about. But I know the students had some great questions. I really appreciate the questions that y'all brought up. So we'll have this recording. I'll put it up tomorrow on the stream channel for everyone to access. And again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. If you guys have any questions that pop up after this, send them to Tara. She can send them to me. We can figure out a way to answer them, I guess is the point.
Okay. And then like Emma, you had one other thing, or
That's it.
Saw a hand, but okay. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank
Sure.
you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Have a good evening. All right.
Bye.
Bye.